Good morning and welcome to The Skinny for Friday, July 31st. I'm Mitch Perry, the senior political reporter for the Florida Phoenix with Ray Roa, editor-in-chief at Creative Living newspaper. Good morning, Ray.
Good morning, Mitch. I'm excited.
Yeah, we're just 18 days away from the August 18th primary election, so that's going to be obviously the focus of our show. But later in the show, we're also going to look at some of the prospects for state elections here in November. We'll also discuss the fate of Democratic National Committee Chair Ken Martin. A lot of negative news coming out about the DNC in the past week. And about, we just heard some of the Democratic Socialists of America from St. Pete. What about that? Is there a potential civil war brewing between the DSA and the establishment Democratic Party? Florida Democratic Party strategist Steve Shale will be with us later in the show to discuss. But first, joining us in the studio right now is St. Petersburg Mayor Ken Welch, working hard to get elected for 4 more years in office. And Ken Welch joins us in the studio right now here on The Skinny. Good morning, Mayor.
Good morning, Mitch and Ray. Good to be with y'all.
Great to have you here with us. Really appreciate you coming in. So, Ken Welch, I think you said maybe it was the first debate that if the Tampa Bay Rays stadium situation hadn't blown up, after 2024 or after the Hurricanes, I think you've said that you don't believe you would be facing a serious challenge for re-election. Is that accurate? Did you say that?
I do believe that. I mean, I was the first mayor in a couple of decades to be able to put together an agreement with Pinellas County, with the Rays, and with the private development team with Hines to move that 40-year-old promise forward. This started when I was in high school at Lakewood High School. And so we celebrated a couple years ago. July 2024 was called Here to Stay at the Trop. And we were all excited. The plans for development, for jobs, for honoring those promises was finally coming to fruition. And then we had 2 hurricanes. And we were in recovery mode. And the previous Rays ownership backed out of 12 agreements that they had already signed, and without any real substance. We always tried to say, well, what are you asking for? And they never could give us a reason they were asking for this other than a possible delay in the new stadium. And of course, we had to repair the Trop. That was a question. We got that done. But, we heard up to $300 million. And I said, for what? That we are a community that the gaps in our infrastructure has been laid bare by these 2 hurricanes, whether it's our sewer plants or our other infrastructure. We are not putting another dime into that. You've already signed a 30-year agreement. If they had gone forward, if we were turning dirt on a new stadium, on housing, on a new office space, I doubt that I would have opposition. But things happen for a reason. We actually have a better plan now, a better team with the Berg bid led by Blake Investments, which is a local development group. Twice the affordable housing. The proposal that I'm working on right now that I've selected has 3,600 units of affordable and workforce housing on-site and off-site. So we've got a better deal. We got our land back from the Rays. They'd had development rights on that. They've had development rights on that for more than a quarter century. We have those rights back now, so we're in a much stronger position.
Okay.
But no, I don't think I'd have this level of opposition.
Well, certainly, I think that some of the criticism, you mentioned the hurricanes, and there was also, a lot of people criticized the handling of the hurricanes, and there's no doubt that nobody, I know you said this, no mayor in St. Pete history ever had to deal with what happened after Helene and Milton in the fall of 2024. And specifically talking about pulling the plug on the Northeast Water Reclamation Facility as Helene hit, which resulted in residents in Northeast St. Pete being told they couldn't flush the toilet, shower, or put anything down the drain for 48 hours because of concerns about sewage. And no doubt you had to do that. However, nobody knew about the possibility that would happen at all in advance. You said the city was already under a mandatory evacuation zone order. Yet, as Colleen Wright of the Times wrote, most of the area affected, homes east of I-275 and north of 30th Avenue North, were not under evacuation orders, and in fact, plenty stayed. And that was different after Milton. I know it's easy to go, for critics to go back on this now, but are there any, lessons learned? I mean, there must be lessons learned in things that happened that you maybe would have happened a little bit differently in terms of how you responded to the storms.
Well, there are a ton of lessons that we learned. Number one, our infrastructure has been underinvested in for decades. That particular plan is 70 years old, and it never has faced 7 feet of storm surge. So, the lesson is sea level rise is a real thing. The climate change impacts from extreme weather that we've predicted for more than a decade are not only here, but they're here faster than they thought they would be, and the impact is higher. And so when we saw that 7-foot estimate for storm surge, we knew that that plant couldn't handle it. And we immediately told folks that, there might be the possibility that you can't do laundry or flush your toilets. We were subsequently had to do the same thing with our Southwest plant because it's a lower level plant as well in terms of the height of the plant. So 2 of our 3 plants faced the highest level of storm surge that they've ever faced in their history. And that's why we had to go about it that way. What we're telling folks now that as you're doing your hurricane planning and putting your week's worth of food and water away and making your evacuation plans if you have to do that, you need to factor in that we might have to shut down sewer plants. That is a new thing for our city, but that's the reality of sea level rise and 40% of our city being in a coastal high hazard area.
So we're talking right now, St. Petersburg Mayor Ken Welch. Obviously, Charlie Crist has raised a lot of money in this race, and he's putting a lot of ads out there. And I know, and I want to get your reaction. One of the ads that he's thrown out there is this, and that I know you've taken umbrage about, is the claim that at one time you were only at work 34% of the time. Now, I know you released a statement back on July 13th. You said this was a form of cherry picking from the COVID era when city government shifted in how and where people worked, and you wrote, quote, "This isn't the 1980s, and we aren't chained to our desks in one building. We adapted how we worked after COVID." But if we go back to another Tampa Bay Times story penned by Colleen Wright, she quoted at the time in that article that came out in 2022 that City Council Chair Gina Driscoll said that she was usually at City Hall 3 times a week. She said more often than not, you weren't there, saying, quote, "I'm not sure how you can effectively run a city of our size without being present in the day-to-day operation of the city." The article also said you had several Zoom meetings scheduled during that time, including Tuesday meetings with your cabinet, who were expected to work in person. So isn't it fair for people to look at that and go, like, what was happening there with you at that time?
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up. First of all, Gina is supporting Crist.
But this was back in 22 when she said this.
No, and she also supported my previous opponent.
Okay, Darden Rice.
After she told me she wouldn't. So there's a lot of history there. When we talk about the swipe card, it is not an ankle monitor. It is not a work monitor. It is not a time card. It's a security device that tells you when I went in a specific door with a specific device. It doesn't tell you if a member of my staff opens the door and I walk in. It doesn't tell you if a member of security detail opens the door.
So the 34% is not accurate?
No, it's not accurate at all. It's not accurate at all. Our cabinet meetings are a perfect example of why we use technology. Our staff is not in one location in the city. They're spread out. So I've got police chief, fire chief, city attorney, public works director. They're all spread out. It's much more efficient for us to have our cabinet meeting, which are Tuesdays, virtually, rather than have all those folks drive into one location, easily an hour off of their schedule, park, come up. And it started, of course, when I was sworn in under COVID. That was the standard. But it was so more effective and efficient to do them that way. That is the way we handle our cabinet meetings. We use the technology. The other thing is I'm out in the community and always have been. If I'm at a check presentation at the police station, as I was recently, there's no swipe card there. And there's an example commonly on Tuesdays. I start with a cabinet meeting. I'm out in the community. I end up, for example, at a city hall on tour, which is where we bring every city department out to a park. Our most recent one was at Lake Vista, where the community comes out. There's no swipe card there. So it's a false argument. Look, if we did not have a high-performing team, we wouldn't have been rated the best run government in the state of Florida by Wallet Hub 3 years in a row.
You said this is a dog whistle, right? You said this
it absolutely
is. That basically is. Unqualified, not hardworking.
Well, he started with, and I'm losing my headphones here, that I'm not qualified for the job. I don't have executive experience. He said that several times.
He being Charlie Crist.
Yeah, then it's I'm not working. I'm not doing the job. How far do you have to go with that to know that it is just a dog whistle? I have a high-performing team. They're well-respected. They're accredited. We win award after award for the performance of our team. Just won the Governor's Hurricane Conference Award for our hurricane response. Oh. And so when folks say that neighborhoods were abandoned, which is Charlie's latest ad, Charlie wasn't even here. He was in Minnesota.
Where's the phrase Welch Piles?
That was started by Kevin Backdorf, who's another candidate for mayor, who wanted us to route more trucks to his neighborhood And we said no.
In short
We said
acres.
everyone has to wait the 90 days. We're not sending more trucks to your neighborhood that will affect other neighborhoods. He's the person that started that. Unfortunately, the Times, every time they write an article, they cite that. But look, we got it done in 90 days. Everyone on up to the state emergency management director, Mr. Guthrie, praised us for doing that. We won the Governor's Hurricane Conference Award. So we had 2 million cubic yards of waste, which is 5 times more than the last 3 hurricanes combined. And we did it in 90 days. And so we had a very effective response to the hurricane.
Okay, another thing that I know that's actually been a back and forth in terms of charges made by Charlie Crist is that about your tenure in office, one of these being that the city has, quote, tripled their spending 4 years in a row. You say that is not accurate.
Well, again, Charlie's putting out false statements. The first one he said is that I tripled the property tax rate, which I didn't. They actually took that ad down.
Yes, they did.
My first 3 years, I cut the millage. But we also increased spending on public safety, on the arts, on complete streets, all the things that people were coming to our budget hearings and asking us to do. The increase is a sign of growth. And it's a great point because he says the city's on pause, which anybody that takes a walk in St. Pete downtown knows we're not on pause. That growth is driven by the new developments that have come online, the 400 Centrals, the other new developments. That's where that new property base is coming from. If you're in your home, as you know, and you've got Sabre Homes, you can only increase 3% a year. So it's not coming from working families. It's coming from the new development, which shows we're not on pause.
Mayor Welch, I want to ask you a couple questions. First off, just talk about news this week. I arrived to the office on Monday, and I see a video of you asking Charlie Crist to condemn a comment from Florida Politics publisher. I assume you have not heard back from Charlie Crist about that?
He has not said one word about it other than what I've read in print that, basically paraphrasing, he doesn't care, that he doesn't know Peter's source. Now, come on. He's paid him $25,000. Peter has been his main cheerleader and recruiter. He's editorialized dozens of times. And so that's a poor sign of leadership. And if you don't think that's the kind of person that's going to influence a Crist mayor's office, I think you're mistaken. So no, there's been no apology. I am going to pursue legal action because it is a flat-out lie. Without any evidence whatsoever.
When are you going to do that?
And he's doubled down. And I'm speaking with attorneys now. There's no rush to do this, but there's been no apology from Crist or from Sorge, who continues to just lie and say that he's got evidence. I know there's no evidence because I know it never happened.
And Michael Van Sickler, previous guest here, Tampa Bay Times political reporter, had a great article this week about the money in the race. Obviously, Charlie Crist has raised so much more money than any of his opponents, a lot of it coming from the GOP. You said to Michael Van Sickler, elections more and more aren't being won by the people with the most money. We can look at New York and things like that. Both of you are actually former Republicans. You kind of came around to the Democrats sooner than he did. What is there to say about the partisan nature of a nonpartisan race, and what does all that money from GOP supporters actually mean, and to voters?
Well, let me just start by saying that all of my elected service has been as a Democrat. So all 25 years that I've served, I've been a Democrat. I've never changed from that. Look, my concern is really more where the money's coming from. Most of it is not from the city of St. Pete or the St. Pete area. It's from Tallahassee. It's from Washington. It's money from 3-4-year-old PACs when he was running for governor or senator or whatever the last office he was running for. He brought in more than $300,000 right off the bat. And obviously the goal was to just throw up as much misinformation through digital ads and TV as possible, like the tripling the tax rate and the, not qualified, not showing up for work, abandoning neighborhoods, all of those things. And just to use money to basically buy this election. If you want to tell me what, Ballard and Company and some of these other outside PACs or the Hard Rock Casino, which gave $50,000, what their interest and concern in St. Pete is, I'd really like to know.
And we should say that, you are now the fifth of the six candidates running for mayor that we've had here on the Skinny. And we've reached out to former Governor Chris several times, including as early as this morning with other staffers. So we got a couple more shows before the August 18th primary election. Charlie Chris still has an invitation to come on here to talk about what we're talking about here. One thing I want to go back to before we go, Ray, and you can have another question, is that going back to property taxes, if we could, I know that the former Governor Chris has said he's going to cut property taxes, and I believe you've challenged him to spell out what that will be. Again, if we get Charlie Chris here, we'll ask him about that directly. But let's talk about, because we've got this Prop 3 coming up, and this is a major issue that all local governments are confronting here right now. Of course, the premise of this is that from Governor DeSantis and CFO Blasingoli is that there's been overspending or alleged overspending or wasteful spending at the local level. Blasingoli did come to St. Petersburg. By the way, he still hasn't come to Tampa, right? Which I think is just really weird. But anyway,
it's only a matter of time.
Well, okay, I don't know when. At this point, he's been doing it for over a year. But anyway, Blasingoli was in St. Petersburg in January, and he said the city had overtaxed residents by more than $49 million over the past 5 years. What did you make of those allegations? I know he's been criticized throughout for saying, like, not spelling out what actually he's talking about. And I believe they were calling out some DEI and climate change programs. So tell us your reaction to all that.
It's just simplistic. It's juvenile. They had a narrative they wanted to support. And so this was just an exercise to say, we're going through an audit, we're doing this. The narrative they wanted to support was getting this property tax referendum on the ballot. That's all they wanted to do. And the way they wanted to prove that is show that all these local governments, blue county, red county, blue city, red city, have overspent. But the numbers don't add up. The math doesn't math. If you take all of our property taxes combined in the city of St. Pete and apply it to police and fire, it doesn't even cover police and fire, all right? And so if you're saying we shouldn't have given police raises, if you're saying we shouldn't have tried to get to our 602 full strength, which we've been trying to get to, if we shouldn't have bought high rescue vehicles for our fire department so they can rescue people during these incidents, if we didn't invest in the call program, which really has national acclaim.
Absolutely, yeah.
For justice.
This is the mental health response from the
Absolutely
police.
Not sending a policeman, but sending a social worker. That's been wildly effective, and we've invested more in that. So he doesn't know what we're spending the money on. He's not taking into account we've got this new growth that's driving it. It's not, burdening homeowners with a Save Our Homes cap and an exemption. It's the new growth that's driving it, and the new growth is helping to pay for the increased demands on public safety. So it was a circus. It was a dote, and there's a lot of waste and fraud and abuse they could find in Tallahassee if they just looked, within 5 miles instead of coming down here.
If you're just tuning in right now, we're 24 minutes after the hour. Mitch Perry and Ray Rowe. We're speaking of St. Petersburg Mayor St. Petersburg Mayor Ken Welch.
Let's get the name right.
I know. Going back,
we've been around for a long time, so we got a lot of trauma from.
Okay,
can I follow up on the property tax thing, Mitch? Should this pass this incredible threshold to actually pass an amendment on the ballot? It wouldn't go into place for a while. You are running
pretty soon, actually, January 27.
Okay, so it's coming up. You're running a campaign. You're also running a city. Can you talk about the preparations for that situation if it happens, and what that looks like in City Hall and your administration? Those conversations.
Yeah, it's dire. First, I'm doing everything I can to inform people about what this actually does. And the more folks learn about it, the bigger the coalition against this becomes. I think the FOP joined the lawsuit
Fraternity of Order
recently because it's going to devastate public safety and other discretionary programs like the arts and homeless programs and mental, all those things we fund. So folks need to understand how devastating that's going to be. I've been there before when Chris was governor and started that kind of cut before, and work with, I think it was in Sheriff Coates, as we had to cut 161 positions from the Sheriff's Department.
Really?
And just really a spreadsheet of positions that we were cutting in Pinellas County government.
This when you're a county commissioner.
That had to go away. We will have to do the same thing in city government. You cannot lose $35 million the first year and then $50 million the next year without cutting personnel and services. And so we look at everything across the board from parks to public safety, library fees, and then the other thing is there's going to be a cost shift because there's some services that we just will not be able to cut And so we have to find new ways to fund that. It could be a millage increase. It could be a fire fee.
Yeah,
we were talking about that today. Imagine going to a public park and having to pay $2 at a park that you're used to going into for free.
You have to pay for the maintenance and operations of these things. And if they take away, $50 million that we're using to do that, and folks still want the service, we've got to find a way to pay for it.
Okay, I want to bring up another ad that's been in heavy rotation in St. Petersburg, and this has been a big issue in the campaign. Your rejection of the proposal for a Moffitt Cancer Treatments Clinic, which also included residences in a hotel in St. Petersburg back in 2022. Now, you rejected it because it included enough, I believe, and you can please elaborate, a large enough affordable housing component. Essentially, you wanted 30% of the units to be workforce housing out of 400 units. Moffitt went up to 17.5%. Now, I just saw this, by the way, a comment made, I'm going to bring this up, from Alan Delisle, who worked in Rick Kreisman's administration.
It was his deal.
Yes, it was. So
he was a city administrator, right?
Right, under Rick Kreisman. Let's put that out there. That's the Rick I was almost going to say your name, but ago. So anyway, he absolutely negotiated, so he feels very personally invested in it. And he said this yesterday on social media. He said, as a certified economic developer, you never, and I mean never, risk an operation like Moffitt on alternatives or possible, quote, if comes. He said, we had negotiated other public benefits that well exceed the cost of the land, including affordable housing. 5 years later, he says, Moffitt is in another community, and St. Pete goes without state-of-the-art cancer care and research, and the Innovation District goes without another huge anchor. It's a major blow to St. Pete's economy.
So much wrong in what Alan is saying. And I understand he takes that personally, and he's been out there talking a lot. But on his way out, there were several deals that didn't make sense for the city of St. Pete. The Municipal Services Center, he had a deal to sell that. Again, about a $20 million discount on the land. The St. Pete City Council refused to authorize that resolution in December of 21, and Councilmember Blackman said, we can't leave $20 million on the table. Same thing with the marina. The council would not move forward with that. This was very similar, where Moffitt had a partner. This was not about Moffitt, and Moffitt did not have surgery on site. This was an infusion center. They had a partner from Atlanta who did want to build housing, hotel and condo, with a $19 million discount on our land. So it's like someone offering you to buy your house. You get offers all the time, and the offer's not, enough money. And so we work with them to say, look, can you get that up? Include more housing, just give us more money that we can put into our housing fund. We did try to work with their partner, and they would not do it. Meanwhile, our conversations with Moffitt never stopped. We talked to them about other locations that you can go to, and they said, yes, if we don't move now with St. Pete, we're going to move to our next city and come back to St. Pete when we're ready. So whenever they are ready, we are. They have to refund, I understand that, but we are ready. The third thing that he said that's really a disservice is that saying that we don't have cancer services in St. Pete. If you go down to 6th and 7th and see the new Florida Cancer Center by Orlando Health, that is twice the size of Moffitt. That includes on-site surgery care and others. That has happened in the last couple of years. They just broke ground a few months ago, and that is on-site cancer service, much larger facility, including surgery on site. So to say that folks have to drive, no, that's not true. Orlando Health has put a tremendous facility right in our backyard.
Mayor Welch, when I talk to people about this race, a lot of them have written off Charlie Crist just because they're not looking for, somebody from way in the past. Same way here in Tampa, they're not looking at Bob Buckhorn. So when I talk to them, they're talking to me about Ken Welch and Brandy Gabbard, right? Mm-hmm. Brandy Gabbard was a huge supporter of you in your first election to lead the city. And obviously, you guys have some disagreements. It's not extremely polarizing, but when you talk to voters, how are you making the distinction between Councilwoman Gabbard and yourself as far as this next phase of leadership in St. Pete City Hall?
Well, I focus on the promises I made in 2021 and the fact that we've kept those promises on the 5 pillars that we have, affordable housing being number one. We were talking about housing way before the affordability term came up. And we put 1,000 units on the ground. We've got another 1,500 or so under development. Been first in the state on things like YIGB, Yes in God's Backyard, on converting commercial and industrial property to affordable housing like we're doing at the Tibbetts property by Gibbs High School, 264 units, all affordable. And so kept the promise on housing, working with Habitat for Humanity, under construction now, more than 40 townhomes which will get folks into home ownership at 80% AMI or less. So on housing, on youth and education services, and on the environment, infrastructure, and resilience, I am fixing 70-year-old problems in our infrastructure that have not been addressed. And when I was in neighborhoods the day after a storm, folks asked me, what are you going to do about all this flooding in our streets? I'm bringing to them a proposal that I conceived called SPAR, St. Pete Agile Resilience, that's going to put $600 million into our infrastructure. And we're asking the voters to vote on that so we can bond it. That'll be on the November ballot. And so the key issues of our city, housing, the historic gas plant, and now our infrastructure for stormwater and water going forward, I've addressed all those issues and many more. And so I'd say look at my track record. And obviously I've stood up to the anti-DEI, the DOJ, all the state and federal preemption. I stood up for our city and our principles. And so I just run on that record.
Okay, and again, if you're just tuning in right now, it's 32 minutes after the hour. You're listening to Skinny here on WMNF 88.5 FM. I'm Mitch Perry with Ray Rowe. In our last few minutes with St. Petersburg Mayor Ken Welch. Mayor, let's talk about the St. Pete Police Department's 287G agreement with the city of St. Petersburg. You did say in one of the first debates in this race that the partnership agreement with the federal government on immigration enforcement was mandatory. You said, quote, it was an order from the governor. It was not a choice at the local level whether to comply with that or not. Now, we know that that's actually not accurate. Did you misspeak? Or when you talked to Chief Holloway about introducing this in 2025, did you know that?
No, I would say let's have a conversation about it, because that is my understanding in speaking with our legal staff and speaking with our chief, that the governor, when he did make that order, that we either can comply with that or the chief and myself as mayor were subject to being removed.
Well, okay.
Folks, let me just, so that's we did talk about it beforehand, had that conversation. St. Pete has not even been trained in the 287G program. We don't have any officers that are active in that now. I also want to say that I have spoken up against ICE and their operations. Certainly the lack of warrants, the murders, obviously. Since day one. What's happening in Minneapolis is not happening in St. Pete. You will never see a St. Pete officer in a mask. The 287G role is a secondary role. They're not actively searching for people. It would be a secondary role if they receive training and do that. And so that was my understanding of it, that the governor did have the authority to do that, similar to the murals. He had the authority to order that through FDOT.
Right. And just on this, the fact is I all due respect, I think you got bad legal advice. And by that I mean, yes, as we've seen, when cities have made cause attention to themselves, like Fort Myers, like Key West, Jay Zuthmeyer and the governor, or James Zuthmeyer, was specifically the Attorney General, has threatened to remove officers. But in fact, the law that was passed in 2025 of the legislature was for counties. So every sheriff in this department in the state, 67, all do have 287G agreements. Not every city in the state does have that. I believe still at this point, Fort Lauderdale does not have it. South Miami actually went to court to clarify this because there was confusion, no doubt about it. So all I'm saying is that, you know, if maybe...
I think, can I just say, I understand where you're coming from. I do understand there's a part of that order that applies to sheriffs who run jails.
Right.
But there is another part that applies to cities. And we asked that question specifically. So we've got a different
because there are cities in the state that's... I wrote the story about a year ago, so it may have changed since then. But there were certainly a number of cities who didn't want to be called out and be written about because they didn't want, the Attorney General is saying, okay, these guys don't have the 287G.
Mitch, I wouldn't have made the determination without having conversations with a lot of cities, including the top 10 cities, the big cities, who meet on a regular basis, and all of those cities came to the same conclusion.
Can you talk about a little bit, we could talk about the legal nuances of 287G and what's required all day, but I think what I heard you kind of describing when you're saying, there haven't been arrests and you guys haven't been trained, I know you don't want to draw attention to yourself, but it sounds almost like a quiet resistance, and please don't let me put those words in there, but what is that tiptoeing like for you, with you and Chief Holloway, from within a municipality that doesn't want a bunch of eyes on it from Tallahassee Tallahassee that doesn't want Uthmeier coming down and doing what he did to Jane Castor. How do you toe that line? Because I think there's a lot of people who are watching this race still unsure who they're going to vote for that would love to just see somebody in the race say, you know what, we're going to get out of 287G. But what you're talking about is a little bit of a quiet kind of resistance and, okay, let's sign it and then, you know, what will happen. Like, so talk about that.
Well, you got to be in the fight to make a difference. If you're taken out of the fight, I think our city is in a much different position. If I'm removed and you know, another person that has more line with the governor is mayor, and so we're very thoughtful about how we approach things. There's certainly, if things cross a line, we're going to oppose it, as we did with the DEI and with the removal of the murals. FDOT had authority to do that. We tried to, they had a process for appeal. We went through that. They said no. So they were able to do that with their own people. I said, you're not using our people. But then we had other ways, like painting the city hall steps in pride colors. You know, we're still going to state, you know, our principles and live on it. We just have to have a smarter way to do it. So the same way on the 287G, there really was no practical way for us to just say no and trigger the governor. I mean, talk to Andrew Warren over here about how that works. You can be in the right. The courts can say you be in the right, and you still can be removed.
The judge is still going to say, I'm not going to interfere.
So for us, the threshold, you know, no mask for St. Pete Police. We're not actively, you know, pursuing folks on immigration. We're not immigration agents. That 287G secondary role, if someone is pulled over, for example, they've got a nice warrant, for lack of a better word, they have an hour to get that secondary person there. Usually it's a highway patrolman, but there aren't many of them. And that's where they have local law enforcement step into that role. You have to be trained to do that. Our folks have not been trained. I'm not sure if any Bay Area police departments have, quite frankly. But that was, you know, something that I said, okay, that's acceptable. We're not out enforcing. We're not wearing masks. We're not doing all those things. It's a secondary role. ICE has been in existence for years. It wasn't an issue under Obama or Biden. It became an issue when this administration put in leaders that led it in a bad direction. So my advocacy has been to correct ICE and the way they operate, and that's what I'm doing.
Okay, we're going to leave it there. Ken Welch, thank you so much for coming and joining us here in the Skinny. Best of luck in your election on August 18th.
Always a pleasure.
Yeah, thank you for making the drive, and maybe we'll see you in the runoff.
Yeah, right. Okay.
Could be.
All right. So again, thank you, Ken Welch, Mayor Ken Welch. That election for folks in St. Petersburg, of course, you can vote by mail right now. Early voting starts a week from tomorrow, I believe it is. And we look forward to that. And again, just one last thing about former Governor Charlie Crist. He has an invitation. We've invited him several times, and we have an opening 2 weeks from today before the August 18th primary. We'd love to have him back on the show. Okay, we're going to pivot now, Ray. We're going to talk to Steve Shale, and if many of our listeners may know Steve, who Steve is, some may not. Basically, he was a main person here in Florida back in both 2008 and as well as in 2012, and helping Barack Obama win the state of Florida back in those halcyon years. Also, he 2020 he had a was it Unite the Country, a pro-Joe Biden super PAC that, of course, obviously supported the candidacy, and then, of course, President Joe Biden. Steve Shale, good morning from Tallahassee.
Hey, Mitch, good to talk to you, man. Hope you're doing well.
Great to have you with us, Steve. Really look forward to talking to you here. So, Steve, one of the things I want to talk to you about, it's about 20 minutes left to go, so we'll get into this here. One of the things I want to know, because I follow you on Twitter, and you're definitely following this has been the summer, let's be honest, in the Democratic Party right now, the summer of DSA, Democratic Socialists for America. And, in fact, we just had in the previous program here, and we're going to have some folks, actually, I want to say right now, from DSA locally here on next week. But there's obviously, there's some tension going on, to say the least, here in the Democratic Party. There are concerns that, some of these victories in some of these more liberal-leaning areas is fine and dandy, but it's going to be used against the Republicans, against the Democrats, in the fall. Let me quote an old school Democrat, Rahm Emanuel, who wrote in the Wall Street Journal last week, I believe it was. He says, the DSA and the others are saddling the Democratic Party with nominees whose wildly unpopular positions will protect Republicans from having to pay the price of Donald Trump's corruption and the price of Donald Trump's corruption and economic incompetence. Tell us your thoughts right now, what you're seeing going around the country with this tension between the DSA and more establishment Democrats.
Yeah, it's interesting. I kind of found myself kind of in the middle of this thing. I mean, I certainly am not a Washington, D.C. guy. I have a rule. I don't spend more than 48 hours there. I feel like if I do, I start using words that nobody actually uses outside of Washington, and then I hate myself. So, but I've always kind of come from the perspective of somebody who's worked in a lean Republican state. I've worked in Republican districts. I used to describe myself as a member of the rational, results-oriented wing of the Democratic Party. And, I think there are two things here that can be true. One is, the DSA has taken advantage of an opportunity that, frankly, establishment D.C. has given them, which is there are just way too many people that have been in Washington for way too long. I was talking to a buddy of mine yesterday about this. There was that race where the DSA won in Colorado, where, the woman who was a member of Congress there had been there since I started in politics, which was a long time ago now.
Right.
And I'd never heard of her. And I mean, I'm pretty engaged. And, you think about how many, mainstream Democrat state ledge folks who term limits, passed on the opportunity of running against her over the years. And and I think, I was part of some interesting survey work immediately following the 2024 election. We actually polled voters in 21 swing counties in 10 states around the country, 10 states that have been battleground states over the last 4 presidentials. And the number one thing people wanted to see from Democrats were just new people. It wasn't like an age thing or an ideological thing. It was just new. And so I think in some of these places, they're providing voters the option between, somebody I probably don't agree with, may think actually is insane, versus somebody who's been in office so long that I have no idea if they've ever done anything for me. And in a change election, that change is gonna win, and we're seeing it win. The thing I worry about is, the actual DSA platform. I mean, there was a poll. I think it may have been that CNN national poll, but I could be misquoting it. Where it said like 41% of Democrats were comfortable with the DSA, but only 18% of all Americans are, which means that there are things in their platform that are just simply not electable. And so, while I can understand why they're having their moment, and at some level can appreciate them taking the opportunity to it, I really worry, normie Democrats are going to have to spend the next 100 days of this election explaining that, no, they don't think we should abolish prisons, and no, we don't think we should abolish the White House and get rid of an independent judiciary and all these things that the actual DSA supports, instead of talking about how we're going to lower costs for people who are struggling every day.
Yeah, along those lines, I read this week an article this week in Vox.com by Asted Herndon, who used to be with the New York Times, and he wrote, I'm quoting here, he says, "I think it matters to read the Democratic Party's post-2024 convulsion as a story of establishment collapse rather than left-wing ascension." He says the party's leadership would prefer to make this a referendum on the left on the acceptability of its candidates and its media figures, but the base is communicating something else, a lack of confidence in the center and a version of establishment politics that prizes seniority and loyalty over voters' values. Establishment collapse also explains the Democratic results that don't fit neatly on the moderate versus progressive binary. And I think you're saying something along those lines.
Yeah, I mean, listen, I think that Asted and a lot of those guys spend way too much time in Washington and New York and don't spend enough time talking to actual voters. And so I often find some of their commentary a little frustrating because it's very much just in their own ecosystem that they want to hear. But at the same time, I think that's exactly right. I mean, I remember a year ago when we were debating the big, beautiful bill in Congress, and I was a very small minority of people in my ideological center that was like, we should absolutely be offering an alternative. Like just being opposed to it is not good enough. We need to go tell voters, yes, we think we should cut middle class taxes. We think that rather than giving billionaires and millionaires another tax cut, we should increase subsidies for health insurance. I mean, we have to lay out a vision. And, the one thing that I can say, and you hear this in both focus groups and see it in polling when you talk to both Democrats and independents who are frustrated with Trump, is they also want us to be more than just about being against Trump. And I think, again, I think that the DSA has offered some views, and not just the DSA, but progressives and just people that are running against incumbents are saying hey, there's got to be a different way. Now, again, the worry I have is that different way may play really nicely in an upper income trust fund supported Brooklyn congressional district of the 78% college educated. It's not going to play as well in Western North Carolina's 11th congressional district, where there's a fourth generation farmer running against a guy named Chuck Edwards. Like, those politics are not the same, and that's, I just think that, like, it's my friends on the left need to understand, like, there are positions that these guys are taking that are going to make it harder for mainstream Democrats to win actual general election voters, not just Democratic primary voters.
What would you say to the criticism that voters have seen these regular Democrats run up and fail at winning office? I think a lot of Democrats are just sick of losing.
But again, like so I mean, first of all, I mean, if you look at the Democrats that have won over the last few years, they are largely normal Democrats. There's a reason why Roy Cooper is killing it in North Carolina, why Mary Patola is killing it in Alaska, why the Arizona governor's race isn't remotely competitive. Georgia's not remotely competitive. Like, the only places right now where Democrats could lose races that we shouldn't lose this cycle are where we're running people that are outside the mainstream. And I get the frustration. I mean, I get angry about it too. But in the end, like, winning a primary to prove a point doesn't really do a damn thing if the Republicans come back in with majorities in the House and the Senate. And I think that, like, we should not lose the U.S. Senate this cycle at this point. Like, but we could lose 2 seats that we should not lose if we're not careful, and both Maine and Michigan. And I think that, I mean, I listen, I said this to a reporter the other day, like, I am not one of these guys who's rooting for these folks to lose. But, like, if we lose the U.S. Senate because we lose Michigan this cycle because we nominated somebody who's way outside the mainstream of median voters, like, do you think people are mad now? Like,
yeah, and Steve, I want to come back to that in a moment about those, because I know you're weighing in on the Michigan Senate race, and that's a big one coming up next Tuesday. But I want to, and by the way, just for our listeners right now, it's 11:48. You're listening to The Skinny here, Mitch Perry, Ray Rowe. We're talking to Steve Shale, longtime Democratic Party strategist here in Florida. I want to talk about the DNC for a moment, because a lot of negative news has really been coming out in the last week, and about Ken Martin, the chair of the DNC, and going back, we'll talk about the money crisis the DNC has, but Steve, I think that, going back to Memorial Day weekend a couple months ago, we had the botched release, if you will, that autopsy from the 2024 election. Were you talk to anybody about that autopsy yourself? Were you part of that at all?
Yeah. Well, so first of all, I mean, just in fairness, like, I called for Ken Martin's resignation when that all went down. Like, and Ken and I had a very interesting 30-minute conversation about my call for his resignation around Memorial Day. And yeah, I mean, I was interviewed for the autopsy multiple times. I mean, I had a very unique perspective in that I was intimately involved in 2020, running a national super PAC that raised about $100 million to support, then President Biden. And I was not involved in 2024 at all because, frankly, the Washington establishment and, for a lot of the folks on the left who are frustrated, the progressive establishment took over the Biden-Harris operation. And a lot of us, who were early folks kind of got shoved out. So I had a pretty interesting perspective on the autopsy. And, as I said to Ken when he and I talked on the phone, like, I think that part of why the DNC is struggling is, and I think part of why this whole moment's happening is, we've never had a real reckoning. And I don't mean reckoning by, like, I want people to lose their jobs and, like, not be able to feed their families. And, like, I think that there are things that happened in 2024. I mean, Biden shouldn't have run for re-election. I've been pretty honest about that. I mean, I don't know how you do anything other than, insert Harris with 100 days to go. But I understand the people that are angry about the fact there wasn't a process. Right. I mean, I get all that. And I think, but there were also, like, I think that, the autopsy was an opportunity to air some of those things. And also, like, I think to learn some things. I mean, there's, one of the things I've written about on places I've been involved with, is there are 770 counties in the country that are in the 10 states that have been competitive in all or some of the last 4 presidential. So you take the 7 battleground states from this last cycle, add Florida, Iowa, and Ohio. There's 770 counties. 703 of those 770 counties have gotten more Republican since 2012. Like, I mean, all the conversations we want to have about other stuff, like, that's not sustainable. And, understanding why that is, to me, was like when I talked to the autopsy people, like understanding why that happened was the most important part of the autopsy. Like, because, in 2032, the recensus,
right, the
redistricting is going to move between 8 and 10 congressional seats from states that are currently blue or kind of blue wall states, so you're New York, California, but also like Pennsylvania, Michigan, Wisconsin. And they're going to move them to states that are traditionally red states, which means two things. First of all, the path to 270 is going to require us to win a Georgia or an Arizona or a Florida or some combination of other states to get to 270 on a regular basis, or North Carolina. And also the path to 270 is going to require us to win more congressional seats in places like Florida and North Carolina and Georgia, Arizona, Texas, Utah. And the most important to me that me think on the autopsy thing was, besides just kind of the reckoning that I think donors needed, was also to lay out a real roadmap. And the failure to do that has frankly created the space for all these other sort of folks to say, hey, we got a plan. And so I don't think the DNC is going to get any better. And in fairness, like the DNC is typically, I think this is a technical term, a shabacle, as the RNC is when there's not a president. Like it's very hard to raise money and lead at these national committees when you don't have the presidency. But I don't think it's going to get any better till we have a nominee.
Right. Yeah. Okay. Right. Let's talk about, we're going here fast here. So I want to get you on talking about Florida here, though. As we look at of course, we got the primary in a couple of weeks and we'll see what comes out of that. It's looking like, obviously David Jolly will be the Democratic nominee for governor. Alex Vindman's probably leading. There hasn't been too many polls against him, against Angie Nixon, but just for conversation's sake, let's say that he does win the Senate nomination. It seems, again, we're talking about a state with 1.5 million more Republicans and Democrats. We've seen these upset victories here in Tampa and Hillsborough back in March with Brian Nathan, the state Senate race. We saw Emily Gregory in Palm Beach, but those were smaller areas, of course, where you got NPA votes and Republican votes switching over. It seems like for Jolly and or Vindman or Nixon to come back and do this on a statewide level, it's going to be even harder to do that. What's your thoughts here going into November if those are the candidates?
I keep answering this question the same way, which is I steal a quote from Republican pollster and my friend Ryan Tyson, who has said that he thinks it's not probable that Democrats win Florida, but it's possible. And I think that's where I am. And that's a different place than I was maybe even 6 months ago, to be perfectly honest with you. 6 months ago, I would have probably been a little more negative. I do think the state level races, the governor's race, potentially the attorney general's race, potentially the CFO's race, I do think those are easier. I use the word easier very cautiously. Don't be like, oh, Shale thinks it's going to be an easy win. It's not what I'm trying to say. But I think there's a clearer path than there is in the federal race. And I like Vindman a lot. I've talked to him a bunch. He thought about running. I think he's a really interesting guy. I just think, when you look around the country, there are almost no U.S. senators in either party that represent states that, that the perception is the state is a Republican or Democrat. I think there's only maybe one U.S. senator or two that represent a state from a different party than how the state voted in 2020 for Biden-Trump. So, the federal races just become very federalized, and it becomes who do you want to run the U.S. Senate? And sometimes it can be harder. The governor's races, there's models. You look at places like Kansas, where there's a two-term, or Andy Beshear in Kentucky, where those races can become a little bit more localized and a little bit more, a little less partisan. And I think when you see in the polling, I've seen plenty of polls that show David Jolly inside the margin of error. I don't really buy some of the polling that has him ahead, but I definitely think he's right there. Now, it's also entirely, reasonable to say that, that Donalds has an easier path to 50, or James Uthmeyer, or Blaze. But I think that, if Democrats win the independent vote by 20 or 25 points statewide, that 10 or 11% edge that Republicans have in terms of turnout, that goes to 3 or 4% really fast.
Yeah.
You take 23% of the vote, and you give 60% of it to one side and 40 to the other, and you do the math, it's like, well, Dems pick up 5 or 6 points right there.
I'm interested in talking about, I'm sorry, Steve, about James Ethmeyer versus Jose Javier Rodriguez, because it seems to me that, and I talked to some Republicans, we had a Republican on the show here a few weeks ago about Ethmeyer, that to the extent that people know who he is, people don't really like what he's doing in some cases. And my thought is, can JJR, though, raise enough money to tell people about what Ethmeyer's done in office?
Yeah, I think there's sort of two things that work there for, that help JJR. And then there's a third problem, which is a real big one, which is, James, James has almost no name ID because he's never been on the ballot. Like, that's not a criticism. It's really hard to have name ID in Florida without being on the ballot. He's never been on the ballot, and most of the press about him has been negative. And so, polling I've seen shows he's, pretty upside down in terms of fave, unfave. Now, that will change as he communicates, but that's kind of where he starts. And JJR benefits from being Hispanic. And, the Democrat, so much of the story of why Democrats suck in Florida right now is a story of just how badly the Hispanic vote has shifted on us in the last 12 years. And frankly, I would argue to my DSA friends, that politics is a big reason why. Socialism means something very different in New York than it does when socialism is a guy with a gun showing up at your grandparents' house in Colombia or Cuba. But JJR and several polls I've seen, is able to, because of his relationship to that community, do a lot better than a traditional Democrat. So he's got two things going for him. The big thing that he doesn't is, it just doesn't make money. I was talking to a Democratic friend of mine out of state recently. I was like, if JJR had $10 million, it would probably be a very different race. I just don't know that he'll ever have $10 million.
Again, if you're just tuning in, we just have a couple minutes left here with Steve Shale, veteran Democratic Party strategist here in Florida. You just mentioned this. I want to come back to this for a moment. We have this big election in Michigan on Tuesday night with Dr. Abdul El Sayed, who is not officially a member of the DSA, but is strongly supported by progressives. He would be the first Muslim senator if he was elected in the fall, running against Haley Stevens, a state or U.S. representative. I believe you're a Stevens fan, Steve, but the polls are looking like Michigan's going to elect El Sayed. Would Democrats, what's your thoughts about it? If El Sayed is the candidate against Mike Rogers in November, how is this party going to deal with that?
My concern about it is just the public data that's out there. You see the same thing in both Michigan and in Wisconsin, that the sort of socialist or socialist aligned candidate just doesn't perform as well, which nobody should be surprised by. It's not a position that, even if it has a majority view among Democrats, it holds a majority view among Americans. And, these are very different electorates. And so, listen, I'm not going to be one of these guys that's out there rooting against El Sayed if he wins the primary. I'm a Democrat, but the math is what the math is. And, we can act like it's not a thing, but he's going to have a harder race. Again, I'm currently sitting in Western North Carolina right now. If El Sayed was running against Mike Whatley in North Carolina, does anybody think he'd be up by as much as Roy Cooper is? No.
Right.
And so, I worry about it. And again, I'm not going to be one of these guys that roots against him, but he's going to have a harder path than Haley Stevens would have in a general. It just, every poll shows it. It's not just vibes, it's actual math. Yeah.
Well, we're going to leave it there. Steve Shale, longtime Democratic operative here in Florida, actually in North Carolina this afternoon, but usually based in Tallahassee. Steve, always great to have you on the show. Thank you so much for joining us here on The Skinny.
Hey, Mitch, always great to talk to you, man. Good luck to y'all. We'll talk to y'all soon.
Thank you. Okay, Ray, well, very interesting. And by the way, we should say, we're going to have, DSA members from the Tampa area on this
Manny
program.
Ramirez, I think, will be on.
I'm not sure if Manny is, but we've got a couple people who have already or will be here. And so we will hear from them and their perspective. And I look forward to that. We're also going to have Michelle Rayner on, who, of course, we had Fentress Driscoll on last week, her opponent in the State Senate District 16 seat. So a couple really, another exciting show coming up next week.
Yeah, and big thanks to St. Petersburg Mayor Ken Welch for coming on the show. That leaves only one candidate in that race that has not come on the show, Charlie Chris. Chris, you are invited to come on the Skinny here on WMNF Tampa. Thank you so much to Skip Sassy on the boards today. I see Anthony Madura on the phones for us today. On behalf of myself and Mitch Perry, thank you so much for supporting WMNF Tampa. Joellen Schilke is in Studio One, ready to treat you like the hostess who loves you the mostest with another installment of Art in Your Ear. Have a great weekend. Wear a raincoat.